Let's start here.
That whole time before Beauty and the Beast got into development and was made as a film was a really interesting time. There was this tremendous kind of dynamic happening with the executive structure at Disney, bringing in Michael Eisner and Frank Wells and Jeffrey Katzenberg.
And one of the things they realized, and Roy Disney insisted on, was that they had to preserve the animation department and revitalize it. Roy always maintained that it was the heart of the company. Neither Eisner nor Katzenberg had had any experience with animation before then.
In 1984, the very first day of work, I went to Michael Eisner's office and sort of had my little checklist of things that I was gonna get onto at the studio. And I was at the door, literally about to walk out the door, and Michael said, hey, Jeffrey, before you go, one more thing. He said, come on over here, I want to show you something. And he walked over to the window of his office and looked out and said, you see that building over there? And he, you know, that's where they make the animated movies. And I went, really? And he said, yes, and that's your problem. So that's my introduction to animation.
Jeffrey came in to really take on the studio and make the studio work. And the first thing he thought about was live action. And if you look back at this period of time, they made tremendous low-budget comedies. Bette Midler and Richard Dreyfuss, finding these actors who had had a career and reinventing them. Animation was occupying some of the most important real estate on the Disney company lot, and Jeffrey needed it for the live-action business that was growing. The animators were moved off the lot.
We got delegated to a warehouse somewhere in Glendale.
I was out for a week or so, and I remember coming back, and I ran into one of the other animators, and they said, yeah, he said, did you hear? They're moving us off the lot. And I was like, no, you're kidding. They wouldn't do that. Why would they do that? And I thought it was a joke. And unfortunately, I found out later that it wasn't a joke. And I still have the copy of the memo from Roy Disney.
I did Roger Rabbit in London, and then I arrived at Disney Animation in America, and everyone was working in a warehouse. It seemed totally normal to me because I didn't know anything else. But you know, then I started hearing stories like, yeah, they kicked us out of the building, and said, what building? So I go to the Disney main lot and see the building that Walt built for them after Snow White. I said, oh wow, this is like hallowed ground.
It was just kind of sad to think that you came to the Disney studio here in Burbank, but animation wasn't there anymore.
I don't blame the powers that be for shifting us around, because we got to do such great work. Ultimately it doesn't really matter what building you're in. Some of the best films that were produced out there, which just goes to show you it doesn't matter where you do something. It's what's in your heart while you're doing it.
Peter Schneider years later said, we needed to move out of that building because it was haunted too heavily by the ghosts of the past. Not in any sinister way, but there was so much legacy attached to that. Some days it really was, you would be sitting at your desk and just think, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy, I can't do this. Whereas when they had us in these, rundown warehouses, it was a more informal environment, and I think it pulled us together. I really did. I think it made us more of a team, more of a family, more of a community. I think it allowed us to be ourselves.
Well, I was hired to run animation when I was hired in 1985. So I came in with the goal to reinvigorate, reinvent animation, and to give it a link back to Michael and Jeffrey, who were running the studio at the time.
Jeffrey Katzenberg really threw himself into the assignment of running the animation division. And I think he was somewhat skeptical in the beginning because his background was live action. But he fell in love with the medium.
And it was amazing watching the transformation of this guy who was so completely Hollywood and live action centered to be won over by animation.
And as he learned to love the legacy, he also came to warn us almost daily. He would say, you guys are worried about Ariel. How is she going to compare to Snow White, and how is she going to compare to Sleeping Beauty? The audience isn't going to compare her to Sleeping Beauty. They're going to compare her to Julia Roberts. And I think it really adjusted everyone's perspective in a very healthy way.
So now all of a sudden you have this group of kids at the studio longing to be, the filmmakers that the previous generation had been, Walt Disney's generation. And now they have their opportunity.
When I started at the studio in '74, a very small group of masters had created, perfected an art form, and they had gotten to a point where they really needed to pass it on to another generation. So we learned from those masters.
Eric Larson and John Lounsbury started a training program at that point to train young artists and bring a new generation in.
There were some very generous animators from Walt Disney's era that could really step in and pass the baton on to us.
And suddenly the films began getting more attention. And as they had in Walt Disney's day, they were not only at the forefront of animation, the art form, they were also at the forefront of filmmaking.
We all knew as a studio that we had been sort of gaining momentum with Roger Rabbit, Little Mermaid, and Rescuers. I don't think anyone really identified it as a period that was going to be looked back on like a second golden age.
Well, the pressure to fill the pipeline with movies driven by VCR sales and just the demand for movies at the box office kind of drove the idea of getting more new ideas. So I got this phone call from Jeffrey Katzenberg and Peter Schneider, and they asked me to jump in and develop a fairy tale called Beauty and the Beast. It was certainly the greatest love story ever told, and we thought, okay, there's something here, we've got it, and we're up for the task. But I don't think any of us ever knew what we were in for, and it was quite a wild ride.
And so we came up with the idea of Beauty and the Beast and brought in writers and started writing it. And we went back to Richard Williams, who was the animator on Roger Rabbit, and we'd had such a good experience with him. We said, would you like to direct Beauty and the Beast? And he said, no, I'm going off to do my movie called The Thief, but my friend Richard Purdom could do it. So we hired Richard Purdom, and I sent Don Hahn to London.
Yeah, we made it to the airport.
With Andreas Deja and Glenn Keane to begin working on Beauty and the Beast. And it was a non-musical.
There was an excitement that we were going to use an English director.
She's an actor. All I've sacrificed for this family. And she does this with the hairbrush, getting the hair out of the brush. All I've sacrificed for this family.
Richard Purdom had his own commercial studio. He had a great style of drawing, and he seemed to just to be a natural fit as an animator. And so we all went out there. It was the first time I'd ever been outside of America as well, and it was just like, wow, my eyes were opened. Don Hahn brought my wife and I and our 2 kids, and we got a little place in Primrose Hill, and I'd walk through down past the London Zoo, and I'd see the wolves and animals there, which I would draw, and ended up using a lot of that influence on the Beast. For me, it was all such a big adventure.
So they began a new life in a humble cottage in the country.
Beauty and the Beast is one of the oldest and most universal fairy tales around. There are any number of variations on it, and it exists in pretty much every culture. But that doesn't mean that it's a story that's easy to tell, particularly not visually.
And then Beauty and the Beast was kind of lying dormant in the Disney morgue for a long time. Walt Disney tried it, and it was always the same problem with that story.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's basically a story about a girl who keeps coming to dinner and keeps being asked to marry and saying no. That's pretty boring, you know?
And I saw it with Richard Purdom, a great respect for the original story, the classic story, and he really wanted to stay very true to that, and with noble intention.
It was going to be much darker, set in sort of an 18th century France, and a small but very talented group had worked on it for about 6 months.
He spins slowly, as he slows down, he spins the other way.
Yeah.
Oh, that's like this. He sees the wolves.
He's gonna show the wolves like coming right up the camera, like
coming right at him. And then the horse comes up and he's riding backwards on the horse now.
Yeah.
That's funny.
I mean, I did this whole wolf fight and storyboarded sequences, and as well as Hans Bacher and Andreas and Tom Cito. A number of artists all worked really hard on this.
And they brought the first 20 minutes back to show Jeffrey and myself.
Once there was a widowed merchant who had a beautiful home and many fine ships sailing the seas.
We were all waiting to hear how it went, and Don came back and sat us all down at the studio there, and he said, well, I've got some good news and some bad news.
And the bad news is, see, throughout the whole movie, and we have to start over again. But the good news is we planned this great field trip to the Loire Valley, and we're going to do research. We went down and we drank wine, and we toured through chateaus, and we took pictures, and we just absorbed all this amazing architecture and countryside from France, a lot of which ended up in the movie. And then we went back and started all over again.
And is in the Disney tradition. Walt threw out the first 6 months of work on Pinocchio because he didn't feel it was good enough, and they didn't like the treatment of Pinocchio, who's more of a wiseacre, Charlie McCarthy character at that point. So they basically started over from scratch.
And for me, that was the big decision. Should we change the leadership? Should we bring in different people? And we've done that traditionally a lot in animation. We've made directorial changes, acting changes, all sorts of changes to try and energize a project when it's not quite going in the right direction. And we did that on Beauty and the Beast.
And in retrospect, rightly so, because it didn't have that pop, that kind of entertainment value.
And the rather be lucky than smart, thesis of life, as Beauty crashed at its sort of stepping out is exactly the time when, Howard and Alan were sort of at the best of their work.
Howard Ashman and Alan Menken had had great success on Little Mermaid, and they stepped in and started to musicalize it.
And it was clear that music was an essential part of this. And we came up with the idea that maybe Howard should just take over Beauty and the Beast. And so Jeffrey buttonholed Howard, as only Jeffrey can do, and convinced Howard to write the songs on Beauty and the Beast with Alan.
And I felt an inordinate amount of confidence that we could do something really special. I don't know why, but I guess maybe in your guts sometimes you know things. I felt like there were some really good people involved.
So we hired two young story artists, Kirk Wise and Gary Trousdale. They had just finished doing something called Cranium Command down in Florida, a very nice little 6-minute piece, and we threw them into this.
And it happened that fast. It was like we were looking around like, there's a hidden camera, huh? And it was that quick. We learned that there had been turnover with the creative leads, and they were they were minus a director again. We were not the first choice. Rob Minkoff, I believe, was the first choice, and he said, "Well, okay, I'll do it if you give me complete creative control." And I'm sure after the executives stopped laughing, they went to their second choice, and they said, okay, Kirk and Gary did this Cranium Command thing, and they didn't screw it up. If we sit on them and really watch them, we'll give it to them. So that's how we got in.
And, it was, our jaws dropped, it was just one of those really rare opportunities that only comes along, a couple times in a lifetime. And even though we were both, scared out of our minds, we knew it was something that we had to do.
We made them the acting directors because we didn't want to trust them with this movie and call them the directors. We called them the acting directors.
Which doesn't mean that we directed the actors. It meant that we were kind of supposed to act like directors, and maybe direction would happen.
The last pedal, he takes his pointer and goes whack. He goes tink against the thing. Falls from this row, tink.
Fortunately, it did. But yeah, it was like a 6-month probation. It was kind of a big deal that they called us in after the storyboard had, gotten up and the reels were more or less bought off on, and it was Jeffrey. It's like, all right, you guys have been doing good. You're going to be the directors now, and so it was like, okay, we're real boys.
Yeah, maybe it was a bit of a leap in it, but they were just stars waiting to happen. So, yeah, it was theirs to lose, And I think that's probably the way I said it to them. You know, come on in, help shape this, pull the team together, show your leadership abilities. And they really did a spectacular job.
Make no mistake about that.
Kirk is just a really sharp story sense.
It'd be wonderful if we could do this all in one shot. It'd be wonderful if we could go down from the ceiling, down to the drop to the floor, and get into this. Yeah, and have them dance into camera.
You can't talk to him very long without realizing, wow, this guy's got a good beat on entertainment. And with Gary, his drawings were just inherently funny. They were easygoing people, fun people to work with.
Amazingly, I took it for granted, but now when I think of it, it was such a gift to work with these guys who were so warm and so funny and just good friends. That joy and that humor that they are so capable of, it came through on the screen.
So that's what happened on Beauty and the Beast. We changed the fundamental mixture of the people involved.
Howard and I were really excited that following Little Mermaid, we were going to be working on Beauty and the Beast. And we started working on story sessions, trying to figure out how we're going to adapt it as a musical, and then turned to writing our first song, which was, I believe, Belle.
Bonjour.
Good day.
How is your family? Bonjour. Good day.
How is your wife? I need 6 eggs.
That's too expensive.
There must be more than this provincial life.
One of the things that was really exciting about starting Beauty and the Beast was the sense that we had a completely fresh start. And suddenly here was the chance to take this material and really kick it up a notch, make it a full-out musical, develop new characters and new scenes, an entirely new movie.
It's very encouraging.
The only catch was we only had 2 years to do it. 1 year had already been eaten up by the previous creative team.
Goodness, look at the time. We never really had schedules when the movie was done. It would come out, and it cost how much it would cost. Well, that's not a way to run a business, and of course, we learned that really fast. So that kind of discipline came from Jeffrey in terms of schedules and budgets, and that'll be what drives our business.
You know, we're in a thing that's called show business. And it's neither just show or just business. And I think having a discipline, having deadlines is actually very valuable. People rise to the occasion having to deliver their best work to a finish line.
So we stayed late, we came in Sundays, we ate cold pizza, we did everything we could to put our nose in it and really learn the craft and try to make the best movies we could.
Kirk and Gary had been put on as directors maybe a month before I came on. And so the movie was just starting to get its rhythm going. Linda Wolverton had been brought on to write the script, and Jeffrey had said, "You're to illustrate Linda's script. Don't change a word." And we all sort of felt like, but that's not our process.
You know, making an animated movie is really tough, and it's a very different process, particularly for people that, like myself and Linda and others who have come from outside.
I was sort of plunged into a world that I did not understand. I didn't understand how the things were reworked and reworked and reworked and put up on boards. And no one really explained it to me.
Animation, by its nature, is a very collaborative process, and I think for some people who work outside of animation, it takes them a little while to get used to it. Sometimes when a writer comes on who's not used to that process, they might feel like, hey, how come you're changing my words? But that's the process.
I mean, we could move them a little closer together.
Gotta move them a little,
but I'm worried
right
about.
now they're like 1, 2, 3, 4.
I'm
really
worried
evenly
about
spaced.
just sight lines.
We're always looking for the better idea, for the better way of doing something, and it's been that way since Walt's day.
In Walt's day, there was very rarely, if ever, any actual typed-up script. He wanted the artist to work from storyboards, and very often he would make them do something entirely in mime and then add dialogue only when they needed it. And on Beauty and the Beast, there were a lot of fights when the directors and story crew basically said, yeah, you tried it this way, now we're translating it into drawings, and we're going to be reworking some of it, and we're going to see what works visually as we develop it. Was not always a happy, peaceful, friendly relationship.
So we had some pretty good arguments. But it was passionate because we all believed in it so much. We all believed that this could be something remarkable.
It was Birth by Fire. And it came to a head at one point in a big meeting. Linda was saying, they're changing my writing, and I was saying, but we have to do our job.
I would write a scene a certain way, and then they would storyboard it, and I would go the next day, and it was entirely not the scene. So I'm not happy.
And Peter Schneider, with his Solomon-like wisdom, said, all right, it sounds like the two of you have to work more closely together, work in the same room. And so it was like, both of us. But really, that was the best thing we could have done, because then Linda came into work, in my room, which I shared with Brenda Chapman, and we started talking about the story. And she started coming around with me on my rounds when I'd go to the story guys and looking at the boards, and she started seeing how the process worked, was getting excited about it, and was feeling a part of it. And when that happens, the sparks start flying. So it was a happy ending.
By the way, thank you for saving my life.
You're welcome.
Musicals, whether animated or on the stage, it's the most collaborative art form. So you could hate somebody, you could love them. If you're working towards a goal together, you're going to work together until you reach that goal. I mean, the headline is the legacy. The headline is not the conflict. The conflict is just something you will endure.
It could be chaotic, and in addition to the high command like Jeffrey Katzenberg, Michael Eisner, Roy Disney, and then we had Howard and Alan, and then you got the lead animators, and each one of them is like the movie star, and they've got something to say about their character, and it is a little like running a circus. You got the bears, or you want to keep them from running amok over here, and the plates are all spinning over here, and there's the fire eater back there, and you want to keep everybody going and everybody doing their job.
You all know your assignments. Half of you to the west wing, half of you to the east wing. The rest of you, come with me.
The story problems were legion.
Yeah, I mean, I think Beauty and the Beast, because it's really a story about these two characters, it was a question of sort of who you want the spotlight to be on. Is this really Beauty's story? Is it really the Beast's story? And I think Howard Ashman's kind of breakthrough was that the character who goes through the greatest change, both inwardly and outwardly, is the Beast. Therefore, it's the Beast's story.
And Howard really did want to create the tragic hero out of the Beast, which he did by creating the backstory of how the enchantment happened. The old beggar woman coming to the castle and him being rude to her and casting the spell on the prince and all. The idea of a curse, a mistake you made a long time ago that you have a very slim chance of ever redeeming yourself. It's about redemption.
I think that was really the breakthrough that perhaps other versions of the story hadn't achieved.
Just a little change. Small to say the least, both a little scared, neither one prepared, Beauty and the Beast.
Telling it through music gave us a lot of shortcuts because, as Howard pointed out, you can say a lot of things through a song that no self-respecting actor would speak. So you can get a lot of obvious boneheaded exposition out through a song, and it's great. Whereas if you just said it, you go, oh, I don't buy this at all.
One of the challenges that we had to face story-wise on this movie was what are the rules of the magic, if you will. We settled early on the idea that all the enchanted objects in the Beast's castle were the household staff of the Beast when he was still in his human form.
Who said anything about the castle being enchanted?
And it wasn't that much of a leap after that. Just to look at the physical aspects and characteristics of the object, the candelabra, it is not so much warm as hot. He's fiery. So you bring the romance into that, and the tightly wound particular clock that's always worried about time and schedules.
This has gone far enough. I'm in charge here.
He was a kind of a mid-level executive.
And I think Howard Ashman came up with ideas like, well, the teapot could be, a little British lady.
How would you like a nice pot of tea, sir?
She could be Angela Lansbury, and he was very specific with some casting ideas, which really enriched the process.
And this wasn't to say that we agreed with Howard all the time. As brilliant a man as he was, he wasn't always right, although he could argue better than any of us and did a great job of convincing us that he was right, you know, a good percentage of the time. But we got our way in a few things too.
Sometimes he'd be teaching us things we didn't want to learn, or he had certain opinions we didn't like. So we had lots of tussles like that. But those kind of fights were really exciting. I remember in one meeting, Alan and Howard had played the song Belle, and we had done some preliminary boarding. In the meeting, I said, well, it seems good, but it seems like at the end here where Gaston's trying to catch up with her at the very end of the song, it feels a little empty musically. So Howard says, all right, well, Alan, you play it. Roger, you show me what you want. And it was like, what? You just sing it. Just make it up. Okay. And, you know, in that moment, then Alan starts playing it, and, you know, da 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 da. I'll have some bread. Da, 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 and I just had to make it. Let me through. And some grapes. You know. And then, so I just sort of winged it up the moment. And at the end of it, Howard said, "Yeah, that's good. We'll do that." But I, you know, rarely was I put on the spot so musically like that to have to improvise. But it was such a learning experience with Howard and Alan.
Casting the movie in New York like a Broadway musical was something, again, that Howard insisted on. And I personally think it was absolutely brilliant. The caliber of talent that we found in New York, the theatrically trained talent, was something that is a little more difficult to find in LA. So we saw like the cream of the crop of the Broadway theater at that time.
I mean, like Jerry Orbach, we had no idea. And this was like before Law and Order. And at the time, we were saying, okay, we don't know who he is. And, oh yeah, he was a big song and dance man back in the 60s. We thought, okay, really? Didn't know that. And Angela, I mean, we knew Angela's background. The others, like Paige, you know, Broadway.
It's a quiet. I think quiet, you know what I mean? So it's got the same value, but it doesn't have the little turn.
Yeah. It's a quiet village.
Yeah.
Howard believed that the people that we cast needed to have very strong singing and acting chops.
Chapter 3. In Beauty and the Beast in particular, he really had his characters perform their numbers. Now that's what we do in the theater. If we have a big musical number, it's performed for the audience.
Right from the moment when I met her, saw her, I said she's gorgeous and I fell. Here in town there's only she who is beautiful as me, so I'm making plans to go and marry Belle.
The character of Gaston, for instance, who starts off the movie, he does the first big numbers. It's really like a huge stage musical number. And he's bounding all over the place, and he's shouting at the top of his voice, and he's got a wonderful voice, and it works, you know.
This is a Broadway show. This is really a Broadway show. I mean, that's how it felt when you read it, and all of these pros came to audition for it.
They auditioned about 500 Broadway actresses for Belle and all the other characters, and pretty much went for an entire Broadway cast.
There must be more than this provincial life.
Just what I'm going to make Belle my wife.
I remember Howard talking about songs have to happen when you've tried to communicate something in your acting, in your dialogue, in every kind of a way possible. And when you can't express it in any other way, you have to sing it in a song. But with Beauty and the Beast, there was this one point where we needed this moment where Belle falls in love with Beast. It just wasn't clicking. And he wrote the song, There's Something There. And that song just lifted the movie over the edge.
True that he's no Prince Charming, but there's something in him that I simply didn't see.
soon as that was in there, it's like, I believe this is real. And here's one of those great gifts that we had for that time.
Howard had an unerring instinct about how to realize these classic fairy tales using the very best of the Walt Disney, formula, if you can be so simple as to say formula, and make it contemporary. If we had two guardian angels, it was, Howard Ashman on one side and Walt Disney on the other.
Howard did bring a tremendous sense of storytelling, a tremendous sense of musicality to these projects. He wasn't a unique man, and I think he